Now, the purpose of the Bible is to testify of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, points to Christ.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. What you do as an educated person is sample that structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization.
Because if those four things are true, that there's truth, that God exists, that miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know that the resurrection occurred, then Christianity is true. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true.
So, what is the food you give to the soul? It is reading the Bible, the Word of God. And I don't care who you are, you cannot live a victorious life if you neglect Bible reading and Bible study.
But what we have at stake here is far more than that. You know, your life depends on this book. So read it.
Exodus chapter 22, Pulpit Commentary, verse 1, If a man shall steal an ox. The principal property possessed by the Israelites in the wilderness was their cattle, whence this occurs to the legislator as the thing most likely to be stolen. It required more boldness in a thief to carry off an ox than a sheep or goat. And so the crime was visited with a heavier penalty. Verse 2, If a thief be found breaking up. Rather, breaking in, i.e., making forcible entry into a house. The ordinary mode of breaking in seems to have been by a breach in the wall. Hence the word here used, which is derived from kathar, to dig. There shall no blood be shed for him. Rather, the blood feud shall not lie upon him, i.e., the avenger of blood shall not be entitled to proceed against his slayer. The principle here laid down has had the sanction of Solon, of the Roman law, and of the law of England. It rests upon the probability that those who break into a house by night bear a murderous intent, or at least have the design, if occasion arise, to commit murder. Verse 3, If the sun be risen upon him. If the entry is attempted after daybreak. In this case, it is charitably assumed that the thief does not contemplate murder. There shall be blood shed for him. Or, the blood feud shall hold good in his case, i.e., his slayer shall be liable to be put to death by the next of kin. For he should make full restitution. Rather, he shall make full restitution. The punishment of the housebreaker, who enters a house by day, shall be like that of other thieves to restore double, if he have nothing. Rather, if he have not enough, i.e., if he cannot make the restitution required, then he shall be sold for his theft. It is somewhat fanciful to suppose that this punishment aimed at enforcing labor on those who preferred stealing to working for their own living kalish. Probably the idea was simply the compensation of the injured party, who no doubt received the proceeds of the man's sale. Verse 4, If the theft be certainly found in his hand. If he be caught in flagranti delicto, with the thing stolen in his possession, whether it be ox, or ass, or small cattle, he shall restore double. The law of theft in the Mosaic legislation is altogether of a mild character, as compared with the Roman, or even with the English law, until the present century. Double restitution was a sort of retaliation. It involved a man losing the exact amount which he had expected to gain. Verses 5 and 6 Law of trespass next to theft. And not much behind it is the wanton damage of what belongs to another, as when a person injures his neighbor's crops, either by turning beasts into his field, or by causing a conflagration in it. To turn beasts in was the more determinately malicious act, and therefore the damage done was to be compensated by making over to the injured party a like quantity of produce out of the best that a man was possessed of, whereas simple restitution was sufficient when fire had spread accidentally from a man's own land to his neighbor's. We may conclude that if the trespass of the cattle were accidental, simple restitution sufficed. And if the fire were kindled of set purpose, the heavier rate of penalty was exacted. Verse 5. If a man shall cause a field or vineyard to be eaten, rather to be eaten of, or to be browsed upon, and shall feed, rather, and it shall feed, of the best, etc. This means that, without reference to the quality of the crop damaged, the injurer should forfeit an equal amount of his own best produce. Verse 6. If fire break out, it is usual in the East, as in England, to burn the weeds on a farm at certain seasons of the year. When this is done, there is always a danger, in the dry parched up eastern lands, of the fire spreading, and carotid watch has to be kept. If this watch were neglected, a neighbor's sheaves or standing corn might be seriously damaged or even destroyed. The law punished such carelessness by requiring the man who had kindled the fire to make restitution. Verses 7 through 13. Law of deposits. Deposition of property in the hands of a friend, to keep and guard, was a marked feature in the life of primitive societies, where investments were difficult and bankers unknown. Persons about to travel, especially merchants, were wont to make such a disposition of the greater part of their movable property, which required someone to guard it in their absence. Refusals to return such deposits were rare, since ancient morality regarded such refusal as a crime of deep dye. Sometimes, however, they took place, and at Athens there was a special form of action which might be brought in such cases, called pi alpha alpha cap alpha alpha theta cap beta delta cap beta. The penalty, if a man were east in this suit, was simple restitution, which is less satisfactory than the Mosaic enactment, he shall pay double. Verse 9. Verse 7. Stuff. Literally vessels, but the word is used in a very wide sense, of almost any inanimate movables. Verse 8. If the thief be not found. It is not clear what was to be done in this case. Kalish supposes that it came under the law of the oath. Verse 10. And that if the man entrusted with the deposit swore that he had not embezzled it, he was let go free. But as stolen cattle were to be compensated for to the owner. Verse 12. It would seem to be more consistent that stolen money or chattel should also have been made good. Verse 9. For all manner of trespass. It has been supposed that this refers to every case of theft, but Kalish is probably right in restricting it to cases where a person was accused of having embezzled property committed to his care. He was in that case to appear before the judges. Exodus chapter 18 verse 23, together with his accuser, and to clear himself if he could. When he failed to do so, and was condemned, he was bound to restore double, which another challenges to be his. Rather, which a man challenges to be the very thing that he deposited. The case is supposed of the depositor being able to point out that the person to whom he entrusted the deposit has it still in his keeping. Verses 10 and 11. If a man deliver unto his neighbor an ass or an ox, etc. The deposit of cattle is unheard of in classical antiquity, but it might well be the usage of a pastoral race. Genesis chapter 47 verse 3. The parallelism of the verse with verse 6 indicates that a deposit of the same kind is intended. If it die, or be hurt, or driven away, the deposited beast might die naturally, or he hurt by a wild beast or a fall, or be driven away by thieves, without anyone seeing what had happened. In that case, if the man to whom the animal was entrusted would swear that he was no party to its disappearance, the owner had to put up with the loss. Verse 12. If it be stolen. If, however, the case was not an ambiguous one, but certainly known to he one of theft, restitution had to be made, since it was supposed that with proper care the theft might have been prevented. Verse 13. If it be torn in pieces. If again, there was evidence that the creature had been killed by a wild beast. This evidence had to be produced before the owner or the judges for the trustee to be exonerated from blame. A similar proviso is found in the laws of the Gentus Rosenmuller, Orient Volume 1, page 148. Verse 14 and 15 Law of borrowing. The act of borrowing is connected with that of depositing, since in both cases the property of one man is committed to the hands of another only. In the one case, it is at the instance and for the benefit of the man into whose hands the property passes. In the other case, it is at the instance and for the benefit of the other party. This difference causes a difference of obligation. The borrower, having borrowed solely for his own advantage, must take all the risks, and in any case return the thing borrowed, or its value, unless the owner was still, in some sort, in charge of his own property. Things hired are not, however, to be regarded as borrowed. If harm come to them, the owner must suffer the loss. Verse 14. And it be hurt or die. The thing borrowed might be animate or inanimate, either might be hurt. The former might not only be hurt, but die, whatever the damage and whatever the cause, unless in the single rare case of the owner being in charge, the law required the borrower to make good the loss to the owner. This law must have acted as a considerable check upon borrowing. Verse 15. If the owner thereof be with it. By with it, we must understand, not merely present, but in charge of it, or at any rate so near it that he might have prevented the damage, had prevention been possible. If it be an hired thing. If anything were paid for the use of the thing, then it was not borrowed, but hired, and the owner was considered to have counted in the risk of loss or damage in fixing the amount of the hire. He was entitled therefore to no compensation. Our own law does not rule this absolutely, but takes into consideration the proportion of the sum paid for hire to the value of the thing hired, and the general tacit understanding. Verses 16 through 31. Verse 16. If a man entice, rather seduce, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. In the East a man commonly pays money, or money's worth, to the parents in order to obtain a wife. The seducer was to comply with this custom, and make over to the damsel's father the sum of 50 shekels of silver. Deuteronomy chapter 22. Verse 29. For his sanction of the marriage. If the father consented, he was compelled to marry the girl, and he was forbidden to repudiate her afterwards. Ibidim. Verse 17. If her father utterly refuse, etc. There might be such a disparity between the parties, or such an ineligibility of the man for a son-in-law, that the father might refuse to re-establish his daughter's status by the alliance. In that case, the offender was to pay such a sum as would form a handsome dowry for the injured female, and enable her to enter with proper dignity the house of whatever man might be selected for her husband. Verse 18. Law against witchcraft. Witchcraft was professedly a league with powers in rebellion against God. How far it was delusion, how far imposture, how far a real conspiracy with the powers of evil, cannot now be known. Let the most rationalistic view be taken, and still there was in the practice an absolute renunciation of religion and of the authority of Jehovah. Wizards. Leviticus chapter 19 verse 31. And witches were, therefore, under the Jewish theocracy, like idolaters and blasphemers, to be put to death. Verse 19. Law against unnatural crime. The abomination here mentioned is said to have prevailed in Egypt, and even to have formed part of the Egyptian religion. Look at the study found online to find the different resources for this information. Though regarded by the Greeks and Romans as disgusting and contemptible, it does not seem to have been made a crime by any of their legislators. It was, however, condemned by the Gentile laws, and by the laws of Menu chapter 11 verse 17. Verse 20 Law against sacrificing to false gods. Sacrifice was the chief act of worship, and to sacrifice to a false god was to renounce the true God. Under a theocracy this was rebellion, and rightly punished with temporal death. In ordinary states it would be no civil offense, and would be left to the final judgment of the Almighty, utterly destroyed. Literally, devoted, but with the meaning of devoted to destruction. Verse 21 Law against oppression of foreigners. It may be doubted whether such a law as this was ever made in any other country. Foreigners are generally looked upon as fair game, whom the natives of a country may ridicule and annoy at their pleasure. Native politeness gives them an exceptional position in France, but elsewhere it is the general rule to vex them. The Mosaic legislation protested strongly against this practice. Exodus chapter 23 verse 9. Leviticus chapter 19 verse 33. And even required the Israelites to love the stranger who dwelt with them, as themselves. Leviticus chapter 19 verse 34. For ye were strangers. Compare Leviticus chapter 19 verse 34, and Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 19. In Exodus chapter 23 verse 9 the addition is made, for ye know the heart of a stranger ye know, i.e., the feelings which strangers have when they are vexed and oppressed. Ye know this by your own sad experience, and should therefore have a tenderness for strangers. Verses 22, 23, and 24 Law against oppressing widows and orphans. With the stranger are naturally placed the widow and orphan like him, weak and defenseless like him, special objects of God's care. The negative precept here given was followed up by numerous positive enactments in favor of the widow and the orphan, which much ameliorated their sad lot. See Exodus chapter 23 verse 11, Leviticus chapter 19 verses 9 and 10, Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 29, Deuteronomy chapter 16 verses 11 and 14, Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 19, 20, and 21, Deuteronomy chapter 26 verses 12 and 13. On the whole, these laws appear to have been fairly well observed by the Israelites. But there were times when, in spite of them, poor widows suffered much oppression. See Psalm chapter 94 verse 6, Isaiah chapter 1 verse 23, Isaiah chapter 10 verse 2, Jeremiah chapter 7 verses 3 through 6, Jeremiah chapter 22 verse 3, Zechariah chapter 7 verse 10, Malachi chapter 3 verse 5, Matthew chapter 23 verse 14. The prophets denounce this backsliding in the strongest terms. Verse 22. Ye shall not afflict. The word translated afflict is of wide signification, including ill usage of all kinds. Oppress and even vex are stronger terms. Verse 23. And they cry it all unto me rather, surely, if they cry unto me. Compare Genesis chapter 31 verse 42. Verse 24. I will kill you with the sword. It was, in large measure, on account of the neglect of this precept, that the capture of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and destruction of its inhabitants was allowed to take place. Jeremiah chapter 22 verses 3, 4, and 5. Your wives shall be widows, etc. A quasi-retaliation. They shall be exposed to the same sort of ill usage as you have dealt out to other widows. Verses 25, 26, and 27 The law of lending money and borrowing. It is peculiar to the Jewish law to forbid the lending of money at interest by citizen to citizen. In the present passage, and in some others, Leviticus chapter 25 verse 35, Deuteronomy chapter 15. Verse 7, it might seem that interest was only forbidden in the case of a loan to one who was poor. But the general execration of usury, Job chapter 24 verse 9, Proverbs chapter 28 verse 8, Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 13, Ezekiel chapter 22 verse 12. And the description of the righteous man as he that hath not given his money upon usury, Psalm chapter 15 verse 5, Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 8, seem rather to imply that the practice, so far as Israelites were concerned, was forbidden altogether. On the other hand, it was distinctly declared, Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 20, that interest might be taken from strangers. There does not seem to have been any rate of interest which was regarded as excessive and usurious in the modern sense. In Scripture, usury means simply interest. Verse 26. If thou take it all thy neighbor's raiment to pledge. Lending upon pledge, the business of our modern pawnbrokers, was not forbidden by the Jewish law. Only certain articles of primary necessity were forbidden to be taken, as the hand mill for grinding flour, or either of its mill stones. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 6. Borrowing upon pledge was practiced largely in the time of Nehemiah, and led to very ill results. See Nehemiah chapter 5. Thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down. The reason is given in the next verse. As it could not have been worth while to take the pledge at all, if it was immediately to have been given back for good. We must suppose a practice of depositing the garment during the day, and being allowed to have it out at night. Verse 27. Wherein shall he sleep? The outer garment worn by the ancient Hebrews was like that of the modern Bedouins, a sort of large woolen shawl or blanket in which they envelop the greater part of their persons. It serves the Bedouins to the present time as robe by day and as coverlet by night. When he crieth unto me. Compare verse 23. If the law is broken, and the man cry unto the Lord, he will hear and avenge him. Verse 28. Law against reviling God, or rulers. It has been proposed to render Elohim here either 1, God, or 2, the gods. Or 3 verses 29 and 30. Law concerning first fruits. God required as first fruits from his people, 1, the firstborn of their children, 2, the firstborn of all their cattle, and 3, the first of all the produce of their lands, whether wet or dry, wine, oil, grain of all kinds, and fruits. The firstborn of their children were to be redeemed by a money payment. Exodus chapter 13 verse 13. Numbers chapter 3 verses 46, 47, and 48, but the rest was to be offered in sacrifice. The phrase, thou shalt not delay, implies that there would be reluctance to comply with this obligation, and that the offering would be continually put off. In Nehemiah's time, the entire custom had at one period fallen into disuse. Nehemiah chapter 10 verses 35 and 36. The first of thy ripe fruits, literally thy fullness. The paraphrase of the A.V. no doubt gives the true meaning. The firstborn of thy sons. Compare above, Exodus chapter 13 verses 2 and 12. Verse 37. Days it shall be with its dam. See Leviticus chapter 22 verse 27. The main object is that the darn may have during that time the natural relief derivable from suckling its offspring. On the 8th day thou shalt give it me. Some analogy may be traced between this proviso and the law of circumcision. Birth was viewed as an unclean process, and nothing was fit for presentation to God excepting after an interval. Verse 31. And ye shall be holy men unto me. Ye shall not be as other men, but an holy nation, a peculiar people. And therefore your separateness shall be marked by all manner of laws and regulations with respect to meats and drinks, designed to keep you free from every uncleanness. One such law then follows law against eating the flesh of an animal killed by another. The blood of such an animal would not be properly drained from it. Some would remain in the tissues, and thence the antrum would be unclean again. The carnivorous beast which tore it would also be unclean, and by contact would impart of its uncleanness to the other. Ye shall cast it to the dogs is probably not intended to exclude the giving or selling of it to a mean, if one were at hand, according to the permission accorded in Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 21. But points simply to the mode whereby the flesh was to be got rid of, if aliens were not at hand, or if they declined to eat the animals. Dogs were so unclean that they might be fed on anything. Their chief use was to be scavengers. 2 Kings chapter 9 verses 35 and 36.